because the scale of this project is really something unprecedented, I think, in the Indian context in contemporary times. So we are talking here of an impact that will be irreplaceable, that will be irreversible for a unique creature, for a rare creature, and a site that's a very unique site.
Hi, you've tuned into State of South Asia, a podcast from Himal South Asian, where we have the best minds on the region to unpack crucial issues affecting our politics, cultures, environments, and societies. I'm your host, Naitara Narayanan. In November 2022, India's Ministry for Environment, Forests, and Climate Change cleared a mega infrastructure project on the Great Nicobar Island, which is the southernmost island of the Andaman and Nicobar Group. The project is called the Holistic Development of Great Nicobar Island and is estimated to cost 72,000 crore Indian rupees. That's about $9 billion, dollars, with a transshipment port, an international airport, a power plant, and a township. The project will take the population of the island from about 8,000 to about 350,000 over a period of 30 years. It will involve cutting between 8.5 lakh and 1 million trees in a pristine rainforest ecosystem, which is so ecologically rich that UNESCO has declared it a biosphere reserve. Not surprisingly, many environmental experts have criticized the proposal, speaking and writing about the environmental damage and detrimental impacts on the indigenous population that include the Nicobarese tribe and the secluded Shompens, of whom only about 250 people remain today. One of those experts is Pankaj Sekhsaria, who is an associate professor at the Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay, and a member of Kalpavriksh Environmental Action Group. He has visited and researched the islands for about 30 years. He has written 4 books on the island and curated a collection of reported work called The Great Nicobar Betrayal. He joins me now to discuss the project, the questionable ways in which it has been pushed through, and its many possible impacts. Pankaj, thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me on this. Thank you very much.
Just before we get into the discussion, I'd like to remind listeners to visit our website, himalmag.com, click on Support Himal and become a paying patron of the magazine, and help us in our mission to show you South Asia like no one else can. Now, on to the Great Nicobar Island with Pankaj Sekhsaria. Pankaj, we'll get into the details of this project and its many problems. But first, I'd like to ask you, as an environmental activist for many years, as someone who knows the Andaman and Nicobar Islands really well, what should development look like in a country like India and in a place like the Andaman and Nicobar Islands?
I don't think that's a very easy question to answer because that's really at the heart of a lot of the discussion and the debate. But I think a few things that strike me, and particularly in the context today of this rapidly changing climate, global warming, and the kind of the onset of the Anthropocene as we understand it, is a recognition of the realities of the place, the geological realities, the ecological realities, and the socio-cultural realities. And I think for me, looking at these islands over the last 30 years in particular, this kind of axis, this trijunction, as it were, where these three things come together, seem to be, I think, very critical for us to look at, certainly for the islands, but perhaps by extension to any other ecosystem or any other place that we are looking at. And I say that because all these three, the ecological, the geological, and the socio-cultural, are very unique in every context, but they also intersect in very significant ways, and an imbalance across any of these is likely to lead to serious problems, of the kind that we are perhaps seeing, what happened in Kerala recently in Wayanad, or what's happening in the Himalayas, where there is a very significant interference and intervention in the geological framework of these places. We're certainly cutting down forests and all that's happening with the ecology, but also, the brick and mortar of the planet, as it were, in terms of, in the Himalayas, for instance, damming of rivers, cutting of mountainsides, road construction, blasting. These are playing in very significant ways with the geological structure. And I'm saying this because, and we'll come to that, of course, but what's happening in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands also is a reflection of that particular thing, or a fear of what will happen if we don't account for the geological realities. In addition, of course, to the fact, like you mentioned, that there are indigenous people here, they've been living here for thousands of years. These islands have pristine forests, the marine systems are very rich. So it's a diversity of things. And the larger question of trying to acknowledge and see what is there, and not aggravate the problems that we are facing, rather than say what we can do. I think also to think about what we should not be doing, and that would vary from place to place. In a place that is tectonically active, like the islands or the Himalayas, as against a place which is perhaps a dryland ecosystem, traditionally, what is the kind of intervention we will make, technological, developmental, are the larger questions that I think we have to be keeping very, very carefully in mind. And I don't think we are doing that enough. So that is what I would kind of say to this first question that you have.
Right, and I ask you that because the development argument is what is pitted against the environment very often, with people forgetting that it actually has to go hand in hand. But coming to the Great Nicobar Island itself, it's a very unique ecosystem. In fact, the entire group of islands is. Because it's an island, there are many endemic species, which means you don't find them anywhere else. And it is a UNESCO biosphere reserve. In an ecosystem like this, what is the possible impact of such a large project like the one that the government has proposed?
It's huge. I mean, it's likely to be absolutely massive because the scale of this project is really something unprecedented, I think, in the Indian context in contemporary times. 9 or $10 billion of investment in one small landscape. Now, this island is about 900 odd square kilometers, which is quite large by island standards. And like you said, there are only about 8,000 people by the census numbers. Actually, there might be even less today in that island.
Mm.
A large part, almost 90% and more, is pristine tropical evergreen forest, which is the home of the two indigenous communities that you mentioned. Now, this one single project across those four components that you mentioned, the port, the airport, a township, and the power plant, envisages the use of 160 square kilometers of land on this one island. So that's roughly 18 to 20% of the land of that island is to be taken over. 130 odd square kilometers is pristine, untouched tropical evergreen forest. This is home to the indigenous communities. There is, you mentioned the Shompen, who are a small community scattered across the forest. We know very little about them. Their entire existence is completely dependent and very deeply interlinked with the forest and the resources. This is a deeply rich ecological system, where we probably don't even know what exists to its fullest extent. So any detailed study, if you look at biological studies, ecological studies, you find that they discover something new every time a detailed study is done. There are a large number of endemic species, small fauna, butterflies, birds, reptilian fauna. So it is rich in all kinds of ways. The marine ecosystem which surrounds this is barely studied. And a project like this, which is a port, uh, the construction that will take place, the dredging that will take place, then the movement of shipping traffic, oil pollution, etc., etc., which are all inevitable in a situation like this. So one actually cannot imagine the scale of the impact that will be there across uh, cultural dimensions to the community. You mentioned 3.5 lakh people. That is the proposal to bring in 3.5 lakh people from outside for this project. Now
Right.
imagine what happens to an indigenous community, which is about, say, the Shompen is 250 odd people. So just the sheer ratio of the indigenous islander to the non-islander, and now, so if 250 people to 5,000 people, assuming there are 5,000 outsiders, which there are, just imagine how that ratio will change. And you bring in 3.5 lakh people there, and their needs, their growth, how can you contain them? The sheer, just the water they will require, the land they will need. You can't contain them to a certain part of the island and tell them you can't go elsewhere. So the impact it'll have on the resources of the indigenous people, on the culture of the indigenous people, it'll be devastating. There's no doubt about that.
Right. And among the widely cited environmental impacts is, people are talking a lot about the leatherback turtle, which has its nesting site on one of the coasts of the island. And despite periodic reassurances from the government, it is a site that was probably going to be endangered. Are there any such specific examples that you can take us through to show how bad the impact is going to be?
Now, let's take the example of the leatherback itself, which is kind of the best known, and there are so many more that we don't know. And there's also a case of the unknown unknown, because we don't know what species are there, we don't know their ecology, etc., etc. So we can never know what the impact will be. But just look at the leatherback. Now, the site of the port is a place known as Galathea Bay, which is in the southern part of the island. It's a place where a river, small river called the Galathea River, the biggest in the island but small by other standards, enters the sea, and it presumably brings in silt and fresh water, and that's how there is this large, beautiful beach, soft sands and wide and long beach at the mouth of the river, which is the preferred nesting site of the giant leatherback turtle. Now, there are two, three things to keep in mind. Where India is concerned, the giant leatherback, which is one of seven species of sea turtles, and believed to be on the planet since the time of the dinosaurs, nests only on the beaches of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. They don't nest anywhere else in India. And it's believed that the Great Nicobar Island, and particularly this Galathea Bay, where this big port is coming up, and there's evidence to that, is one of the most important nesting sites of the giant leatherback in the entire northern Indian Ocean. So, from whatever little data we have, the largest number of nestings year to year happen on this particular site. Now, this is a bay which is about 13 square kilometers or 11 square kilometers in area. It's like a cup kind of dimension. Is exactly where the port is going to be located. And for the port to come up, they're going to build a breakwater, and the breakwater will restrict the opening of the bay by 90%. So imagine a leatherback turtle, and there are three other species of turtles that nest here. And this bay also has coral reefs, has mangroves. There are cetaceans, dolphins coming in. We don't know what is there, but just for the turtles. Turtles are swimming into the bay and reaching this nesting site, this beach, through a very wide opening today. That will be restricted by 90%. It will be only 10% of an opening, which will also eventually be used by ships and stuff like that. So it is very, very unlikely. It's almost impossible that these turtles will be able to access the nesting site anymore after this. So we are destroying what is among the most pristine, the most valuable, and the richest nesting site of the leatherback. And like I said, this small ecosystem, and this is just a small component of this island. There are saltwater crocodiles found here. There are mangroves found here. Just beyond where the turtles nest is littoral forest, where there is a very unique bird known as the Nicobari megapode,
Hmm.
which is found only in the Nicobar Islands on planet Earth, not just in Great Nicobar, but just a few more, a couple more islands in the group, nowhere else on planet Earth. That land will be gone. So we are talking here of an impact that will be irreplaceable, that will be irreversible for a unique creature, for a rare creature, and a site that's a very unique site, which also in 1997 was proposed to be a wildlife sanctuary for the nesting of the turtles, which was very explicitly and specifically denotified in 2021 to allow the port to come up.
Right.
So there was a meeting in the National Board for Wildlife where very explicitly, the minutes are very interesting. They say that we denotify this because the port has to come up. So it's not being denotified because it's not ecologically valuable anymore, but just because it will come in the way of the port and this particular project. So there are many examples of this kind. The oceans, like we said, are barely studied. This bay has coral reefs, which has been documented in the project reports. Almost 20,000 colonies of corals are there in that bay. So we really don't know what we're going to lose. It is absolutely huge. There's no doubt about that.
Right. And ever since this proposal came up, you've been writing a lot about what this project entails. But, you've called it a misadventure of huge proportions, even calling it a lethal folly. We talked about the resource strain, if this project goes through and these 3.5 lakh people come into the island. But apart from that, this is a geologically sensitive zone as well. And, there are questions of whether it will actually support such massive infrastructure. Take us to the implications of trying to build these things, this port and airport and township, on in an area that's geologically sensitive.
I think this is very, very pertinent, and this is the point I was making in the beginning on the geological dimension. So we are in the 20th year of the tsunami of 2004. It's a very poignant moment, let's say, for the kind of devastation and destruction that we saw across South and Southeast Asia, and we seem to have forgotten a lot of that. Now, these islands, and also this part of the world, saw something very interesting in addition to the tsunami, which is the earthquake. Now, while for say mainland India and other parts, they were affected by the waves of the tsunami, what happened in parts of the world, including the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, is huge tectonic displacement. So when the earthquake of December 26, 2004 happened, parts of the Nicobar Islands, including Great Nicobar, saw permanent subsidence of about 15 feet. So in the book that we mentioned, The Great Nicobar Betrayal, on the cover, if you see, there's a picture of a lighthouse on the right hand side top. And this lighthouse stands surrounded by the waters of the Andaman Sea. A pre 2004 picture of this lighthouse shows the lighthouse standing far above the high tide line. So, what happened in the morning of 26 December 2004 is that probably even before the tsunami came, the land subsided. And in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, it's very fascinating because parts of the Andaman Islands, which are in the northern part of this group, saw uplift. So, they saw in parts an uplift of 5 to 6 feet, which is very substantial. And the Nicobars, Central Nicobars and Great Nicobar, saw a subsidence of 15 feet. Now, an entire coastline has changed so drastically. And this port is going to come up on exactly that coastline. Now, imagine another earthquake, another tsunami, because this is almost, if I may use that analogy, is the DNA of this landscape. We are on the ring of fire, which a lot of Southeast Asia very recognizes very significantly. Regular earthquakes happen here. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands, on an average, experience one earthquake a week. Of course, everything is not 9 on the Richter scale like happened 20 years ago, but who knows when the next big earthquake comes. So, so for a moment, even if we forgot or ignored the ecological cost or the cost to people, just the sheer investment that is going in is so terribly at risk, because imagine another big earthquake and another displacement. The entire logic of the port will be changed. And then you're bringing in 300,000 people to this island. They will all be on the coastline. And you cannot imagine the kind of destruction that took place in these remote parts 20 years ago. So, are we not putting not just the infrastructure or the ecology, but even the new entrants, the people who are brought here for labor, for business, or whatever the plan is, which itself is quite difficult to understand? Are we not putting all of them in harm's way? So it just does not seem to make any sense to be able to be doing this over here. And we have evidence of the fact that the change and the destruction that took place.
So, given this economic angle, the fact that it is such a big financial gamble, can I ask you to hazard a guess as to why the government is so adamant and is trying to push this through? Because at least that economic logic should apply that it's a huge risk.
So, that is something I don't fully understand. I mean, I don't understand economics and that field. It's a question that, we are all asking as to what is supposed to be achieved. Now, if you look at the project documents, there are some numbers. And actually, I've been asking people in the logistics business or friends who have some understanding of business and economics to look at the shipping, or who look at the shipping industry, to look at those figures and look at the larger context in which this is located. This is a transshipment port. What does the transshipment port mean? What is the additional infrastructure that's required? How much traffic is really going to come? How much is a realistic expectation? Even in the best scenario, does this work out economically? So I don't know. And there are better people who perhaps have an idea, who would be able to tell us more. And anybody who's listening in here, if they'd like to look at the project documents and do an assessment of sorts, it will be very valuable to understand what even the economic viability of all this is. And again, in the context of the disasters, in the context of the possible impacts in terms of the risk to investment, I'm assuming that there's going to be a larger cost for the investment as well. It's not just about building the port, but also accounting for the very substantial risks a place like this and a project like this will kind of entail.
Right. And there is also a strategic argument, right? That it's an important island in the Indian Ocean and it is kind of could be built into India's counter against China's expanding influence in the Indian Ocean. But is it still worth the risk? I think that's the question we're all asking.
That's one question. The other is to look at the project itself. And there is no defense component in this entire $9 billion project. This is an
Wow.
out and out commercial project. This is a $5 billion transshipment port. This is a township, a greenfield township and tourism project over 150 square kilometers of land. So if you look at it's like saying you can come and have leisure and pleasure. And then there's a power project and there's an airport. So it is not even formulated or conceived as a defense project. So I think that the question has to be asked as to where is that argument coming from? Because nowhere in the forming, in the proposal, in the conceptualization of this project, is there any element of a defense or a strategic component. So this is a commercial project out and out, and the proposal that went for clearances. You mentioned November 2022 talks about an entirely commercial project. Talks about seeking the permissions and the clearance for something like I just mentioned, for a transshipment port with this business potential, for this area of land where so much real estate value and construction and township and stuff like that. So it's not really a defense project in that sense.
In November 2023, Edith Mirante wrote a detailed piece for Himal on the misguided development projects in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. She wrote that even if the government's grandest plans never materialize, immense and irremediable damage can be done by just phase one preparations. This includes deforestation, pollution, habitat disruption, loss of ancestral land rights, and more. You can read that story on our website, himalmag.com. It takes a lot to bring you in depth, independent coverage of places like the islands and of the whole of South Asia. And at Himal, we rely on listeners like you. Support our work, which will help us bring you more stories and produce more podcasts like this one. You can become a patron of the magazine by clicking on the link in the episode notes or by going to our website and clicking Support Himal. You can also sign up to our newsletters to keep up with our latest stories, events, and more. You'll see a sign up link to our newsletters also in the episode notes. Now back to our conversation with Pankaj Sekhsaria. Pankaj, you have written, and many other reporters and commentators have shown that from the beginning, the processes of government clearances for the project have been flawed. You already mentioned the National Board for Wildlife, and even the Wildlife Institute of India, the National Green Tribunal, at one point said it would not interfere with forest environmental clearances. How has this happened that collectively institutions have not really followed procedures?
This again is another mystery in the sense of why it's happening. But in some senses, I think we are seeing this where at least environmental issues are concerned, land issues are concerned. We are seeing this in many, many places across even mainland India for that matter. So I think there is a general push for a kind of development that entails large resources to be taken in and taken up. But why is it happening? How is it being allowed to happen? Is as much a question to me as the question that you're asking. What I find quite amazing and striking in this project in particular is to just kind of reiterate the scale at which they have it's gone about and that has happened. And I've written also about how the precision, the coordination, and the speed with which clearances have happened. So, for instance, the project proposal is not even ready, is not even there, and permissions have been asked for de-reservation of forest. The project proposal is not even there. A project proponent had been appointed by the government. Like I mentioned, the National Board for Wildlife, it denotified a wildlife sanctuary, not for any ecological reasons. There is also, in the same vein, in January of 2021, the Government of India, Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, issued a National Marine Turtle Action Plan. And that lists the Andaman and Nicobar Islands as one of the most important marine turtle habitats in the country. And Galathea Bay, in particular, is listed as one of the most important even within that. But just 15 days before the MOEFCC has released this Marine Turtle Action Plan, the National Board for Wildlife, which is another arm of the same ministry, has actually denotified that sanctuary. So everything has been taken care of in that sense. All the denotifications have happened, the clearance have happened. Now, this project, if you look at the environmental clearance, the project proposal was prepared by AECOM India Private Limited, was released in March of 2021. Within a year and a half, in November 2022, the environment clearance is granted. which is a very rapid thing for a country like India for the scale and the way the bureaucracy works. So 72,000 crores, $10 billion, such a large complex project, and with a very shoddy EIA report, by the way. I mean, that's another very sad dimension of the whole thing. Nobody's looked at that, nobody's questioned that, or not questioned it enough. The bodies of the ministry have thought it is okay. So it's really being coordinated and pushed. Of course, there are many problems with that. But the fact of the matter is that forest clearance, stage one forest clearance is there, environmental clearance and CRZ clearance is there. And when somebody took the matter to the National Green Tribunal, like you mentioned, they refused to intervene. And the book actually has a very nice and very solid article by a very well-known lawyer, Norma Alvarez, who also writes, who didn't argue this case, but she investigates and writes about how the NGT has completely, missed out on its mandate to look at environmental issues. So that's really tragic, because it was created to look at environmental issues, and they completely bypass their mandate and their responsibility.
You mentioned the tsunami of 2004. During that, several coastal villages where the Nicobarese live were washed away, and at that point, they were displaced. This had already affected their lives and livelihoods. In fact, many of them want to go back to those coastal areas where they lived for ages. This project again has enormous implications, like you said, on the lives and culture of the Nicobarese and the Shompen, and they are classified as particularly vulnerable tribal groups in India. They have rights that are enshrined in India's laws. How are these being bypassed when it comes to this project?
I'll just make a small clarification, is that only the Shompen is a particularly vulnerable tribal group. But of course, the Nicobaris also are scheduled tribes, and they have substantial, like you mentioned, rights under the Indian Constitution. So there are two separate things, and briefly, if I might talk about them, the Nicobaris are coastal dwelling communities. The Shompen are largely forest dwelling, and the Nicobaris, like you rightly mentioned, were very badly hit in the tsunami. I think a combination of the subsidence and the waves. They live all along the coast, and they large number of their people died. And there are two very kind of, if I may use the word, very beautifully written pieces in the book by two very senior scholars who have worked in the islands, and it's kind of quite moving in the way that they write about the challenges and the plight and the history of these people. And in the case of the Nicobaris, they were displaced because everything was lost. They were brought to temporary settlements, and with the promise on the one hand and their desire on the other to go back to their lands. They've been wanting to go back. It's 20 years now, they've not gone back. And now it happens that in some cases, at least, those lands which were their traditional lands and which they would have wanted to go back are now part of the project area. So they will never be able to go back. And as a matter of fact, in the book again, there is a letter written by the what are called the captains of the tribal community of the Nicobaris, who have withdrawn a no objection certificate that they had given in the legal process to using for the project. So when the whole process happened, they were approached and they gave their NOC. And subsequently, and not very much later, almost immediately, when they looked at some details, they realized that they would not be able to go back to their lands because they won't be available anymore. And they wrote a very detailed and a comprehensive letter saying that we were not given enough information, and we withdraw our NOC, because they realize that if the project is allowed to go through, then they don't get to go back. So, I mean, that's really tragic, if you look at it that way. It's a small community, it has been living here for thousands of years. So that's one aspect of it. The Shompen, like you mentioned in the very beginning, are quite secluded. There's very limited communication with them. They have lived in whatever they have been living in those forests for thousands of years. They have a very specific way of living, lifestyle, social structure, from what little is known. And they will, of course, also be impacted because, again, directly some of the areas that are sought to be taken for the project are their foraging and habitat areas. And then there will be a ripple effect into the forest lands, people going in, resources, etc., etc. And the cultural interaction that happens. And we know again and again that in cases like this, the more vulnerable community and the more vulnerable culture does lose out. All kinds of habits and impacts are seen from communities. And even within the Andaman Islands, we've seen this in the case of the tribal communities in the Andaman Islands. And this is well known from all over the world. So it's kind of going to be extremely devastating for these communities.
Quite a bit has been written about the kind of cultural and knowledge that we will lose if these communities are displaced, because already younger generations don't know what the older Shompens who had just passed away knew about the area. And that will only be accelerated by this, won't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, this is simple, straightforward, and there is going to be that. So there is that knowledge loss, but also there's going to be an entire community or a couple of communities might perhaps get wiped out completely, culturally and physically.
All this background of how we've got here and how this project has come about, where does it stand right now? Do you have any hope? Do you see any way that it might be stalled or it might be scaled down to not be as damaging or invasive as it is now in the way that it's been envisioned? Is there a role of the courts? Is there an option of legal recourse? Where do things stand at the moment and where can we go from here?
So from what I know, almost nothing is happening on the ground. But like I've also said, all the clearances and in that sense, the ground has been laid metaphorically. It's like it's almost about to begin, so to say. So whatever is required in terms of clearances and the statutory provisions, all those processes have been completed. There are some small things here and there that are still being figured out, and we are also seeing all kinds of very bizarre things happening in terms of there are so many dimensions to this whole thing. So if I might, I'll come to this point that you're making, but I just make this point which I just read in a recent document about a couple of days ago. There's a meeting on the 4th of October. I was reading the minutes of that, of the project proponent. These you mentioned 1 million trees, right, in this forest. Now that is a gross underestimate, because recently in the last month or so there have been at least two reports based on speaking to scientists who know these ecosystems to say that, so this 8 lakh figure that you mentioned was actually there in the project documents, to say that we will lose about 8 lakh trees, which is phenomenal already in a context of climate change and in a pristine forest of the kind that we have in Nicobar, and there's almost 1 million trees. Now, if you look at the density of a forest of this kind, a mature tropical evergreen forest, estimates of the number of trees that might be standing and might be we might we might lose is actually 3 million to 10 million. So the project could lead to the cutting down of as much as 3 million, minimum of 3 million trees. Now that is the scale of which we're talking about. Actually, the project proponent recently called for an expression of interest for somebody to cut those trees. And who's going to cut those trees? It's not so easy. And if you look at some calculations of the timber operations that happen in these islands, how much timber can be cut on a yearly basis, it's a very complex and an involved operation. And in the minutes it says you cut the trees, and then so there are the hardwoods and the softwoods. The softwoods can be fed into a power plant so that it is consumed easily. Now this is one is, it is not even there in the project proposal, but the lack of knowledge and understanding. And I was thinking, this is almost akin to getting into a library, pulling out an old manuscript, tearing the pages and then putting them into the fire for the evening barbecue, or you kind of demolish a ancient temple or a heritage building and then crush the stones and make a road out of it. It's almost amount to that, because this is a pristine forest that's not there anywhere else. We will lose it forever. Now, the complexity of the project, the very fact that they have to now think, how are we going to cut the trees, who is going to cut the trees, and all kinds of interesting agencies have shown an expression of interest, including Konkan Railway, including some green consultancy agencies in Delhi and in Gurgaon. So what is their capacity? What is their history? So why I'm saying that is because as we go along almost on a daily basis, we see these interesting new things come up, which also kind of points to the absurdness and the bizarreness, including the fact that this is going to be compensated by 260 square kilometers of land in Haryana to be declared as forest. So there's a certain singularity of this particular ecosystem. You can't replace it like this. So there are so many aspects to that, and we keep uncovering, and one realizes how bizarre and absurd it is. So coming back to your question, I think one is not nothing much, or almost nothing is started on the ground. It might start anytime. I mean, because all the clearances are there and they are pushing. Recently, they started to do a survey for the displacement of the small settler settlements, because that land has to be taken over. So, what land is there, etc., etc. So, something of those kinds might have begun. Where the second part of your question is concerned is, I think there is a lot of hope, and there is concern, and I do feel that we will be able to communicate and convince the people in charge that this is not a good idea, whichever way we look at it. And there is, of course, I mean, that's all I can say. I think there is hope. There's a lot of information that we have been able to put together. There has been a lot of concern that has been raised. There's a lot of media that is there. The very fact that we are having this conversation means that the word has gone around. People are worried, are concerned, are asking questions. There has been some amount of discussion in Parliament over the last 2 or 3 sessions. Questions have been asked. So that is the hope, and that's the only thing we can do, is to keep raising our concerns, and hopefully we will be heard. My hope is that more will be done, because there are many things to be further studied, written about, whether it's media, whether it's the scientific community, whether it is the youth groups today who are doing a fantastic job of raising awareness. So, all of this is happening. It's happening slowly. It's happening on its own, because it's quite amazing, the kind of interest that has been shown, and uh, the kind of different things people are doing. So, yes, there is hope. I mean, that's why we're doing this. It is a priceless uh, part of this country, of this world, and it's not worth losing for anything, certainly of this kind, which does not seem to also offer the benefits that are claimed to be, because a lot is being missed out. A lot is being, either deliberately or because of not knowing, is being completely ignored. So I think bringing that out, talking to people, communicating, um, I think there will be some change.
We should keep trying.
We have to keep trying. Yes.
Kind of coming back to the first question I asked you about the idea of development. Do you think that there is a way that there can be a sort of commercial development of this island that is not destructive, that that could benefit the people living there, but also is in the interest of people on the mainland, of the government itself? Or is the best thing to do to leave it as it is? What do you think?
That is a tough question. I would kind of weigh in towards the latter part of the suggestion, that better leave it alone. It's we have enough of places and where things are possible to be done and is being done. This place is really remote. This place is really unique, and it's also going to be a very difficult place. It's a risky place to work in. I think the effort should be to improve the lives of people who already live there. There's a very small population, and I think if the efforts are made towards that end, then I would say, why not leave it alone for what it is? That, considering all these dimensions, considering the vulnerability of the place, the sensitivity of the place, the richness of the place, the uniqueness of the place, the singularity of so many dimensions, it's not worth kind of disturbing, at least not at this point of time, not when we are discussing such a large project, such a massive intervention. So even if we have to think of something, it cannot be as a foil to this. It cannot be because we are doing this so large and you're not okay with this, let's do something at least. I mean, that has to be a different discussion. That has to start differently. That has to be engaged with in a different manner. The starting point has to be different. The frame of reference has to be different. The people calling the shots have to be different, because sitting far away where we are and making these decisions, I think, is problematic, because we don't really understand. We don't know the specifics and the nuances of the place, and in the absence of that, we are likely to create more problems than actually offer opportunities.
Right. I want to read out a line from one of the articles that you wrote that is featured in the book, The Great Nicobar Betrayal. You say that we, in an era of an advanced climate crisis, signed away an ancient forest, a million trees, a bewildering array of biological diversity, and an irreplaceable repository of the planet's ecological history. Pankaj, I want to ask you, on a scale where so called development projects in India are stacked up based on their environmental costs against real or imagined future benefits, where would you place this Great Nicobar project?
I mean, on a scale of 10 out of 10, in that sense, in the sense of, there is it's a huge impact. I mean, like you said, I've called it a monumental folly. I have called it many things. I mean, and almost everybody agrees who looks at what it is. So the kind of impact that will be there, One is the known unknown, the known known, the known unknown, and the unknown unknown. Across all three, we are going to lose stuff. People are going to be impacted. The ecology is going to be impacted. The traditional people. When I say people, I mean the non local people. The settlers will be impacted. The indigenous people will be impacted. The biological diversity will be impacted, and the investments are likely to be at highly at risk. So, and this is completely irreplaceable. There are creatures here that we don't know about. There are creatures that we know about that don't exist anywhere else. There are, the giant leatherbacks that nest in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands have been tracked to swimming then to Indonesia, to Australia, to Madagascar. So these are one side journeys of 10, 12,000 kilometers. So these are the creatures that are networking the world, and from a time much before we came into being. So, we think of, I was think of India, South Asia, Southeast Asia connections, and the political kind and the cultural kind. But there's a much deeper connection that already exists. We are part of the same. The islands is part of that same Southeast Asian region, as it were. The same tectonics, the same ocean. The connections are far deeper. Turtles have been swimming those waters for millions of years. They've been nesting on Nicobar, then they go and nest in Indonesia, then they perhaps go to Philippines, then they go off to Australia. We don't know. We know very little. That's priceless. These are connections that are far older and far more intense, and something that we could work with. And particularly where Southeast Asia is concerned, I think there are huge opportunities to look at it that way. Of course, there is business and trade and tourism, etc., etc. But the connections actually are much deeper, and it's a part of this country that we have completely ignored. One is, it is, the extremes of where we look at it from. So we keep thinking of the islands as being remote, right? But it's remote because we are looking at them from Delhi. You sit there in Port Blair or in Great Nicobar, then it is Delhi that is remote, and Indonesia is the neighborhood. It's 100 nautical miles from there. So I think the centering and the decentering is also very important to look at. So yes, in a scale of, of what's to be lost, there's nothing bigger than this. For the scale of what is proposed, for the scale of the proposed impact, and for the richness and the uniqueness of that landscape. There are very few places like that anywhere.
That's such a lovely idea, and one we should be thinking more about these deeper connections. Pankaj, finally, I'm going to ask you for three recommendations to understand both this moment better as well as the history of the islands. This could be a book or a movie or another podcast. What are your top three recommendations about the Andamans and Nicobar?
I would say a Great Nicobar betrayal, I think, is certainly one to be able to look at this particular project. I did this other book a few years ago, which is called The Islands in Flux, which is a collection of 30 years of my journalism in these islands. So the first piece was published in 1998, and we did a issue of the book, which is collection over 30 years, and then we did a very recent updated edition in 2024. So I think that would be very interesting reading, because it tells us parts of the island story which we don't normally get to know. And as a matter of fact, I hope I don't look like I'm promoting my own books, but I mean that's the best I know that I can suggest. Actually, the preface of the book, I write about this journalist, I think this British journalist who wrote to me saying that he came to the islands with something in mind and some ideas in mind, and he happened to come across an earlier edition of this book, and he said the way he started to look at the islands was very different, because there were so many aspects of these islands that he had no clue about. And this is not to say that I'm the only person, but there are many others who are also writing and engaging, but a lot more can be done, because places like this, I think, in the larger context, get looked at, as I mentioned earlier, as adjuncts, as additional things to the larger story. So we know these islands as a tourism place, as where exotic tribes live or where a huge disaster happened. But the realities and the minutiae of that particular place, their histories, they're very rich histories. Then they're not adjuncts anymore. And this is true of any place. It could be even a big city or a big metropolis like Bombay. We don't know everything about it. So when we only know of a place, and particularly like this, as an outsider, then we are told a few things and we have only time for that much. But once you start looking at the history, the dimensions of it, and it is so fascinating, this place, so fascinating, even historically, ecologically, geologically, indigenous people, the settler communities. We have people from Burma who live here, who were moved in the early part of the 20th century. People from different parts of the country that were brought to the Andaman and Nicobar. Their stories have barely been told. So, and the beginning to be told. I mean, the whole set of Bengali communities, Bengali speaking communities that came from what was former East Pakistan that live over here. They were brought in here, given land. So there is so much about this place and the disasters and the challenges. So Islands in Flux tells that story in bits and pieces of the legal interventions, of the violations, of interesting things. So I would say these two. There is some interesting fiction on the islands, but not a lot. There is a book called Latitudes of Longing by Shubhangi Swaroop, which is it's a very beautiful book, and a part of it is based in the Andaman Islands, and I think that might be an interesting one to kind of look at. But yeah, I mean, I can't think of more than that, and that's kind of also indicative of we don't have enough that's being written or being spoken or being filmed and stuff like that. There is a bunch of short films done recently by Round Glass Sustain, which is this website that focuses on environmental and ecological issues. And they're doing a series of very interesting shots on these islands, and particularly on Great Nicobar as well. And there's some very beautiful short films that somebody might want to see, particularly on Great Nicobar and the leatherback and the megapode that we're talking about. So yeah, I don't know if that's a bit of an unfair set of suggestions, but that's what comes to mind.
But thank you so much for those suggestions. And thank you, Pankaj, for joining us today on State of South Asia.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
That was Pankaj Sekhsaria on the State of South Asia podcast. You can read more about the Andaman and Nicobar Islands over the years on our website, himalmag.com. Read about how tourism interests and enhanced road access threaten the existence of the indigenous Jarawa in the Andaman, or about the linguistic diversity and endangered languages on the islands. You'll find these stories and more in the episode notes. Don't forget to tune in to the next episode of the South Asia Review of Books podcast, hosted by Shweta Srikantan, where she speaks to the writer Ari Gautier about his two new books, Lakshmi's Secret Diary and Nocturne Pondicherry. Follow the Himal South Asian podcast channel on your podcast app to find all our latest episodes, and you can share, rate, and review them. Don't forget to sign up to our newsletters to keep up with Himal's work. This episode was edited by Ritika Chauhan. We'll be back soon with another in-depth conversation on the next episode of State of South Asia with me, Nandara Narayan. Thank you for listening, and see you then.